She hadn't said a word in 3 days. Just a stranded pilot, drinking cold coffee, waiting for a ride home. Then a SEAL captain slammed his fist on the table and asked one question: does anyone in this room know how to fly an A-10? Nobody answered. Until she stood up. Before we get into how we got here, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. The forward operating base didn't look like much from the air. A scattering of plywood huts, a single cracked runway, and a perimeter of HESCO barriers baking under a sun that seemed personally offended by human presence. On the ground, it looked like even less. Dust. Wire. Exhausted men. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the air conditioning had been dead since Tuesday, and nobody had the energy to fix it. The generator outside coughed every few seconds like it was dying too, slowly, on principle. 60-some operators, support staff, and logistics personnel were crammed into a room built for half that number, all of them staring at a laminated map pinned to a sheet of plywood, all of them silent. At the head of the table stood Captain Daniel Reyes, a man built like a slab of concrete left out in bad weather. His uniform was soaked through at the collar. His eyes hadn't blinked in what felt like a full minute. "Say it again," he said into the radio handset, though he'd heard it perfectly the first time. He just needed a second to not believe it. Static. Then a voice, thin and cracking under gunfire. "Widow 1-6, this is Ghost 3. We are pinned. Repeat, we are pinned. Contact from the North Ridge, contact from the East Wash. We count at least 40, maybe more coming down from the high ground. We are danger close and we are running out of everything." Reyes closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and looked around the room. 4 men. A 12-man reconnaissance element that had gone in 6 hours ago to observe a suspected weapons cache and had instead walked face first into a reinforced ambush. 8 of them had already fought their way to a rally point half a click south. 4 were still cut off in a dry creek bed with a ridge full of fighters closing in from 2 directions. The quick reaction force had been scrambled 40 minutes ago and had made it exactly 4 miles before their lead vehicle hit a pressure plate. 2 wounded, 1 vehicle disabled, the road now suspect for another 20 kilometers. There would be no QRF today. Not in time. Air support had been requested the moment the ambush was confirmed. The answer had come back within minutes, and it hadn't been the answer anyone wanted. A weather system had rolled in from the western desert, grounding every fast mover on 3 different airfields. Visibility near the objective was reported at less than a mile and falling. The only fixed-wing aircraft on this base capable of flying in that soup and still putting ordnance exactly where it needed to go, low and slow and mean, was sitting on the tarmac fully fueled, fully armed, and utterly useless. Because the only qualified pilot on base for that aircraft was currently under anesthesia in the aid station, having taken a chunk of shrapnel through the calf during a maintenance test flight 2 days earlier that had gone sideways when a tire blew on landing. Reyes set the handset down like it had gotten heavier. Around him the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, the way rooms do when everyone in them understands the math and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. 4 men. 40 fighters. A ridge with better ground than his men could ever hope to hold. He had run more of these scenarios in his head over the years than he could count, and every single one of them ended the same miserable way when the air support column on the whiteboard came back empty. He looked at the flight surgeon standing near the door. "How long until he's conscious?" "Hours, Captain. Best case." "We don't have hours. We have 20 minutes before that ridge collapses on top of my men." Nobody answered him. Nobody could. The lieutenant responsible for air liaison stood near the radio bank looking like he wanted to sink through the floor. He'd already called every contact he had, and every answer had been the same polite, useless regret. Nothing else could fly. Nothing else could fly, and nothing else could fly, until it stopped mattering how many times he heard it. Reyes planted both hands on the table and leaned over the map like he could physically will the situation into changing. "I need a pilot," he said, louder now, not shouting, just making sure every corner of the room heard him. "I have 4 men who are about to die in a ditch, and I have an aircraft with a full combat load sitting on that runway doing nothing. Does anyone in this room know how to fly an A-10? The question landed and died in the silence. Radio operators looked at their hands. A supply sergeant looked at the floor. Nobody moved. And then, from the back of the room, half hidden behind a stack of water crates, a folding chair creaked. She'd been sitting there for 3 days. Nobody had paid her much attention, because there wasn't much about her that demanded attention. She wore a uniform that didn't quite match anyone else's unit patches, her hair tied back in a braid that had seen better days, and she'd spent most of those 3 days nursing bad coffee and reading a paperback with a cracked spine while she waited for a transport that kept getting bumped down the priority list. She was a pilot in transit, grounded here by a mechanical failure on the aircraft that was supposed to carry her home, and in 3 days she had said maybe 40 words to anyone in the building. Her name, according to the manifest nobody had bothered to check closely, was Major Sarah Kessler. Nobody knew much else about her. She had arrived on a transport that developed a hydraulic fault 20 minutes after wheels down, grounding it indefinitely and leaving her in a kind of administrative limbo that base life occasionally produced, present, accounted for, and entirely without a job to do. She had spent the first day sleeping. The second day she had helped a supply sergeant reorganize a pallet of water bottles because it gave her hands something to do. The third day she had mostly just sat, read, and watched the base move around her the way a person watches weather, present but uninvolved. If anyone had asked her what she did for a living, she would have told them the truth in the flattest possible terms, and most people would have nodded politely and moved on, because a tired-looking woman in a borrowed uniform corner of a logistics hub didn't fit anyone's picture of what a fighter pilot was supposed to look like. That mismatch between appearance and capability had followed her for most of her career, and she had long since stopped bothering to correct it before it mattered. It rarely mattered. Today, apparently, it was about to. She set the paperback down on the crate beside her. She stood up. The chair scraped against the concrete, and the sound cut through the room sharper than it had any right to. Heads turned. Reyes turned last, and when he saw her, something in his expression flickered, not recognition, not hope, just confusion at the sight of someone he hadn't clocked as part of any of this. "Who are you?" he asked. "Major Kessler," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room had gone quiet enough that a whisper would have carried. "I fly warthogs." The lieutenant near the radio bank found his voice first, and it came out strangled. "Ma'am, respectfully, you're not on this base's flight roster. You're not cleared for." "I flew combat sorties in this airframe for 6 years," she said, cutting him off without raising her voice, without even looking at him. Her eyes were on Reyes. "I have 1,100 hours in the A-10, 400 of them in theater, close air support, danger close work. I am currently sitting in your building doing nothing while 4 of your men die on a radio channel I can hear from across the room." Reyes studied her the way a man studies a bridge he's not sure will hold his weight. "You're serious. I don't joke about ordnance. You understand what I'm asking. Danger close, sandstorm visibility, hostile ground fire, and I can't guarantee you'll have a clean run at any of it." "I understand exactly what you're asking," Kessler said. "You're asking if I'm willing to fly." "I am." "Show me the grid." For one more second Reyes hesitated, the weight of the decision sitting visibly on him, a strange pilot, unverified, uncleared, about to take a 9-figure aircraft into a storm to save 4 men who might already be beyond saving. Then the radio crackled again, another burst of frantic gunfire distorting a voice that was getting more desperate by the second, and the hesitation evaporated. There was no version of this where waiting cost less than moving. "Grid's on the overlay," he said, sliding the map toward her. "Ghost 3 is here, in the wash. Hostiles pushing from the ridge to the north and the draw to the east. You'll have friendlies within 50 meters of anything you put down. Kessler leaned over the map, and something in her changed as she did. The vague, tired posture of a woman who'd spent 3 days waiting for a flight sharpened into something else entirely. Her eyes tracked the terrain lines, the elevation marks, the 2 red arrows marking enemy movement, and she committed all of it to memory in the space of maybe 4 seconds. "Cannon loaded?" she asked. 1,100 rounds, mixed load. 2 500-pound GBUs on the racks, and I believe a pair of Mavericks. Call sign. Whatever you want it to be. Reaper 2-1, she said, already turning for the door. Tell your men to get their faces in the dirt and keep them there. And somebody find me a helmet that isn't already broken. She didn't run to the door so much as move through it with the flat, economical urgency of someone who'd done exactly this kind of sprint before, in exactly this kind of heat, more times than she cared to count. Outside, the wind was already picking up, carrying the first fine grit of the coming storm, and the sky to the west had gone the color of an old bruise. The flight line was 1/3 of a mile from the TOC, and she covered it at a dead run, her boots slapping the cracked asphalt, sweat already soaking through the borrowed uniform before she'd covered half the distance. The aircraft sat at the end of the row exactly where the lieutenant had said it would be, squat, ugly, unmistakably purposeful, its twin engines mounted high on the tail, its nose built almost entirely around the housing of a rotary cannon so large it looked like an afterthought that the rest of the airplane had been built to carry. A crew chief was standing near the nose gear, headset around his neck, radio in his hand, clearly having just gotten word that someone was coming. He turned as Kessler approached and his face did the same confused double take everyone else's had. "You're the pilot," he shouted over the wind. "I'm the pilot," she said, already climbing the boarding ladder. "Talk to me." "Status?" "She's fueled, armed, APU's been running for 20 minutes on standby. Cannon's hot, 1,100 rounds, 2 GBU-12s on the outboard stations, pair of AGM-65s on the inboard. Pre-flight's not complete, ma'am, we were still." "No time," Kessler said, swinging over the canopy rail and dropping into the seat. The cockpit smelled like hot electronics and old sweat, the accumulated residue of 100 sorties flown by a man she'd never met. She reached for the harness straps and began clipping them across her chest with hands that moved faster than conscious thought, muscle memory taking over where checklist discipline would normally have gone step by step. "Get the ladder clear. I need engines lit in under 2 minutes. Ma'am, standard start sequence is." "I know the standard start sequence, Chief. I don't have the luxury of it today. Clear the ladder." He hesitated for exactly as long as it took to recognize that arguing was a waste of the seconds she didn't have, then dropped down the ladder and hauled it back. Kessler ran her hands across the instrument panel with the fluency of a woman reading a language she'd never really stopped speaking, flipping battery switches, checking fuel flow, bringing the engines online one after the other. The twin turbofan spooled up with a deep, rising howl, and the whole airframe began to vibrate with the particular low shudder that told her the aircraft was alive and ready to be pointed at something. She pulled the borrowed helmet down and settled the mic against her lips. "Tower, this is Reaper 2-1, requesting immediate departure, priority air support tasking." The response came back fast, no argument, no delay, word of the situation had clearly outrun her across the base. "Reaper 2-1, you are cleared for immediate takeoff, winds are 280 at 25 and building, visibility deteriorating fast to the west. Good luck." "Copy. Rolling." She didn't taxi to the threshold. She lined the nose up with the runway centerline from where she sat and pushed the throttles forward, the aircraft lurching into motion, heavy with fuel and ordnance, groaning as it picked up speed against a crosswind that was already strong enough to nudge the tail sideways. She fought it with rudder, watched the airspeed climb, and at 130 knots she hauled back on the stick and felt the wheels leave the ground. The base fell away beneath her, and ahead of her the sky was already turning the color of wet cement. "TOC, Reaper 2-1 is airborne, en route to grid, request updated situation on Ghost 3. Reyes's voice came back immediately, tight with the particular strain of a man listening to his own men die in real time and being unable to do anything but relay information. Reaper, Ghost 3 reports hostiles have closed to under 100 meters on the east flank. They are nearly out of ammunition. They need immediate suppression on the ridge to the north and the draw to the east. I say again, danger close, distance between friendlies and hostiles may be as little as 50 meters. Copy, danger close. ETA 4 minutes. Kessler pushed the throttles further forward and dropped altitude, skimming low over terrain that blurred beneath her at 300 knots, the jagged brown landscape rushing past close enough that every ridge and wash felt personal. The storm was rolling toward her from the west in a wall of churning dust that seemed to be eating the horizon whole, and she knew with total certainty that she would be flying the last part of this mission with almost no visibility at all, guided by instruments and radio calls and whatever she could glimpse through gaps in the blowing sand. She keyed the radio again. Ghost 3, this is Reaper 2-1, I am 2 minutes out. I need eyes on your position. Can you mark? The voice that answered was young, breathless, edged with something close to panic held together by sheer discipline. Reaper, this is Ghost 3, we have red smoke, popping it now. Copy, red smoke. Keep your heads down and stay off that radio unless it's critical, I need the channel. The terrain began to fold into the shape she remembered from the map, a dry wash cutting between two ridgelines, walls of broken rock rising on either side, the kind of terrain that turned the valley into a natural kill box for whoever held the high ground. As she dropped lower, she caught the first thin thread of red smoke curling up from a cluster of boulders near the wash floor, fighting to stay visible against a sky that was rapidly losing all its color to blowing dust. I have your smoke, she said. Confirm friendlies are at the base of the smoke, hostiles on the ridge and in the draw to the east. Confirmed, Reaper, that's us, danger close, repeat danger close. She armed the master weapon switch, watched the indicator lights blink green across the panel, and felt the particular, focused calm settle over her that she remembered from every mission that had ever actually mattered, the narrowing of the world down to geometry, distance, and timing, with every extraneous thought stripped away because there was no room left for anything but the shot. Ghost 3, I am inbound hot. Keep your faces in the dirt. This is going to be loud. She rolled the aircraft into a shallow dive, the altimeter unwinding fast, the ridge rising up ahead of her through gaps in the swirling dust. Muzzle flashes flickered along the rocks, small, frantic sparks of light, fighters pouring fire down into the wash where four exhausted men were pressed flat against whatever cover the boulders offered. She adjusted a fraction of a degree with the rudder, walked the targeting reticle across the ridge line, and squeezed the trigger. The cannon tore the sky open. It wasn't a sound so much as a physical event, a violent shredding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the aircraft bucked hard against the recoil, the nose dipping under the force of 30mm rounds, leaving the barrel at a rate that turned solid rock into a wall of pulverized dust and debris in less than 2 seconds. She held the burst, walked it along the ridge exactly where the muzzle flashes had been thickest, and then released the trigger and hauled back on the stick, feeling the G-forces slam into her chest as the aircraft clawed its way out of the dive. Below, the ridge had gone silent. What had been a firing line was now a smear of settling dust. Reaper, that's outstanding, that is outstanding, ridge fire has stopped, Ghost 3's voice came back, cracking with something between disbelief and relief. We still have movement in the draw to the east, they're trying to flank, maybe 15, 20 fighters. Copy, coming around. She banked hard, fighting the aircraft through the tightening confines of the wash, the walls close enough now that she was navigating more by feel than by sight as the storm swallowed the last of the visible horizon. And then something slammed into the airframe with a crack loud enough to hear over the engines, and the aircraft yawed violently to the right. Alarms bloomed across the instrument panel, a chorus of warning tones and a synthesized voice calmly announcing catastrophe. Right engine oil pressure. Hydraulic system failure. She glanced at the gauges and understood immediately, a round, probably from a heavy machine gun she hadn't seen and hadn't had time to avoid, had punched through the wing root and taken the right engine and a hydraulic line with it. Shutting down the right engine, she said aloud to no one, her hands already moving, killing the fuel feed, pulling the throttle to idle, hitting the fire suppression switch before the warning lights could finish telling her what she already knew. The aircraft immediately tried to roll onto its dead side, and she fought it with rudder and aileron, the controls suddenly heavy and sluggish as the hydraulic pressure bled away and the aircraft dropped into manual reversion, flying now on cables and pulleys and raw physical effort instead of hydraulic assistance. "Reaper, you're hit, are you hit?" Reyes's voice cut through the radio, sharp with alarm. "I'm flying heavy, TOC. Lost the right engine, lost hydraulics. I still have ordnance and I still have a flanking element bearing down on my friendlies. Reaper, abort, climb out and return to base, that is a direct." She reached up and turned the volume down rather than off, because she needed the channel open in case Ghost 3 called again, but she had no intention of listening to an order that would have her flying home while 20 fighters closed the last 100 meters on 4 men with empty magazines. That was a decision for later. Right now there was only the geometry of the draw, the cluster of heat and movement crawling down the rocks toward the smoke that marked her own people, and 2 missiles still sitting on the rails. She wrestled the wounded aircraft around, the controls fighting her at every degree of bank, sweat running into her eyes, her right leg shaking with the effort of holding the rudder against the drag of the dead engine. She lined the nose up with the draw and switched her weapon selector to the Mavericks, watching the grainy infrared feed populate on her display, a cluster of heat signatures moving in a loose file down the rock face. "Ghost 3, keep down. Last pass." She slewed the crosshairs over the center of the formation and waited the half-second it took for the seeker to lock, the tone in her headset shifting from a search chirp to a steady confirmation. "Rifle," she said, and pressed the release. The missile left the rail in a streak of white smoke and fire, and 2 seconds later the draw erupted in a fireball that lit up the swirling brown dust from beneath, a shockwave rolling visibly across the terrain and triggering a small avalanche of loosened rock that buried the approach the flanking element had been using. Through the storm and the smoke she caught only the barest glimpse of it before the recoil of the departing missile threw her already unbalanced aircraft further out of trim, and she had to fight the controls with both hands just to keep the nose from dropping. "Draw is closed," she said into the radio, her voice tight with exertion. "Ghost 3, report status." There was a long pause, filled with nothing but static and wind, long enough that her stomach began to tighten around the possibility that she'd been too late after all. Then the voice came back, hoarse, disbelieving, alive. "Reaper 2-1, perimeter secure. They're falling back. Ridge is gone, draw is gone, they're breaking contact. We are alive, Reaper. All 4. Something in Kessler's chest loosened, just slightly, though there was no room yet to feel it fully. "Copy, Ghost 3. Good work holding. QRF is inbound to your position once the road clears. Stay tight, stay low." "Copy that, and, thank you. Whoever you are." She didn't answer that. There wasn't time, and there wasn't a version of herself right now that had the words for it anyway. She turned the wounded aircraft south, toward a runway she was no longer entirely sure she could reach. The flight home was its own separate battle. The A-10 bled hydraulic fluid the whole way, the dead engine dragging at the airframe like an anchor, and the storm that had been closing in from the west finally caught up with her 20 miles out, swallowing the aircraft whole in a wall of blowing sand that turned the world outside the canopy into a featureless brown void. Vertigo set in almost immediately, her inner ear insisting the aircraft was banking when the instruments swore it was level, and she forced her eyes onto the artificial horizon and made herself trust the gauges over every screaming instinct in her body. "TOC, Reaper 2-1, I am in the storm, 0 visibility, request vector to the runway." "Reaper, turn to heading 190, you are 5 miles out, crosswinds at 35 knots and building. It is bad down here." "It's not great up here either," she said, and meant it as something close to a joke, though nobody laughing. She fought the aircraft down through the blowing dust with her right leg trembling from the strain of holding the dead engine's drag in check, watching the altimeter unwind, watching the airspeed hold just above the edge of a stall she could not afford in an aircraft with no power steering left in its bones. The landing gear came down with a heavy double thunk, and a warning light told her the nose gear hadn't fully locked, and she decided, with the flat clarity of someone who'd run out of better options, that it would simply have to hold. The runway threshold appeared out of the storm at the last possible second, a smear of lights in the brown gloom, and she brought the aircraft down hard, the right wheel striking first, the left a fraction of a second later, the whole airframe shuddering as it settled onto the concrete. She stood on the brakes without the benefit of anti-skid, felt the tires lock and smoke, fought the aircraft as it swerved toward the runway's edge, and hauled it back onto the centerline through nothing but raw physical effort until it finally, mercifully, rolled to a stop with less than 100 feet of runway left beneath it. She sat there for a moment with her hands still locked around the controls, the engines winding down, the storm howling outside the canopy, and let herself breathe for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. When she finally popped the canopy and climbed down the ladder, her legs nearly buckled beneath her. A Humvee pulled up through the blowing sand, and Captain Reyes climbed out of it and walked toward her without saluting, without shouting, just looking at the smoking tires and the ragged hole torn through the wing root, and then at her. "Ghost 3 is linked up with the recovery element," he said. "All 4 are alive. All 4 are coming home." "Good," Kessler said. It was the only word she had left. Reyes studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he doesn't quite have the vocabulary for yet. "You disobeyed a direct order to abort." "I did." "You also just saved 4 of my men with an aircraft that was actively falling apart around you." "I did that too." He almost smiled. "It didn't quite make it all the way there, but it got close. Get inside. Get some water. We'll sort out the paperwork later." She nodded and walked past him toward the TOC, her boots dragging through the blowing sand, and when she stepped back through that plywood door, the room went quiet the way it had gone quiet before, except this time the silence held something different in it. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. This wasn't the kind of place that did that, and she wasn't the kind of person who would have wanted it if it had been. She walked past the water crates to the same folding chair she'd left 3 hours earlier, and there, sitting exactly where she'd set it down, was her paperback with its cracked spine and her cup of coffee, long gone cold. She sat, and the chair creaked under her the same way it had before, and she picked up the cup and drank from it anyway, because it was there and because her hands needed something to do. Nobody had asked her to fly that day. Nobody had put her name on any roster, cleared her for that cockpit, or promised her anything in return for climbing into a damaged aircraft and flying it into a sandstorm on behalf of men she had never met and would likely never see again. She had simply been the only person in the room who could, and when the moment came, she had not waited to be asked twice. She looked ordinary, sitting there in the corner with her cold coffee and her borrowed uniform. She had looked ordinary for 3 straight days. But ordinary had never been the right word for her. It was simply the word people used for someone who hadn't yet been asked the one question that mattered. Outside, the storm kept howling against the plywood walls, and somewhere out past the perimeter wire, 4 men were walking home under their own power because a woman nobody expected anything from had stood up out of a folding chair and quietly said, "I fly warthogs." That was all it had ever taken. Later, long after the storm had blown itself out and the base had settled back into its ordinary rhythm of heat and waiting, Reyes would tell the story differently depending on who was asking. To the officers who filed the after-action report, he would give them the facts in the clean, clipped language such reports demanded: grid coordinates, munitions expended, damage assessment, casualties averted. To the men of Ghost 3, when they finally sat down together over lukewarm coffee, he would just say that a stranger in the wrong uniform had walked to the front of the room and asked to see the map, and that had been enough. Kessler never told the story at all. 3 days later, when a replacement transport finally rolled onto the tarmac with room for 1 more passenger, she packed the same bag she'd arrived with, said a handful of quiet goodbyes to people she'd known for less than a week, and left the way she'd come, without ceremony, without a parade, without anyone quite managing to find the right words for what she'd done. The paperback with the cracked spine went with her. The cold coffee did not. Somewhere over the ocean, on a long flight home she hadn't asked for and hadn't wanted 3 days earlier, she thought about the ridge, the draw, the red smoke, and the sound of O'Neill's voice. She'd learned his name eventually, from the after-action debrief, telling her all 4 were alive. She thought about how close it had come, and how little time there had been to think about anything except the next 10 seconds, and the 10 after that. She did not think of herself as brave. Bravery, in her experience, was usually a word other people used after the fact, standing safely on the ground, looking for a way to make sense of a decision that hadn't felt like a decision at all in the moment it was made. What she had felt, climbing into that cockpit, was something closer to obligation, the simple, unglamorous math of 4 men needing an aircraft in the air and only one person in the room capable of putting it there. She had not weighed the risk to herself against the odds of success. There hadn't been time for that kind of arithmetic, and she suspected, if she was honest, that she wouldn't have done the math differently even if there had been. Back at the base, her folding chair sat empty in the corner by the water crates for exactly 1 day before somebody moved it to make room for a new shipment of supplies, and by the following week nobody who hadn't been in that room could have told you it had ever been there at all. That was the strange arithmetic of places like that. Everything urgent eventually folded itself back into the ordinary grind of heat and waiting, and the people who mattered most in the worst moments rarely stayed long enough to be remembered by anyone but the ones they had actually saved. But 4 men went home to their families because a woman nobody had been counting on stood up out of a folding chair on the worst possible day, and said 4 words that cost her nothing to say and everything to mean. I fly warthogs. Sometimes that is the whole of what heroism looks like. Not a speech. Not a plan years in the making. Just someone ordinary enough to be overlooked, extraordinary enough to be exactly what the moment required, and quietly, without asking for anything in return, standing up when everyone else in the room had already decided there was nothing left to do but wait.